Hey everybody, I'm going to do a quick review of chapter 10 of the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. Title of chapter 10 is Satan. So the chapter starts with Malcolm and Shorty receiving their sentence. They received several 8 to 10 year sentences that were going to be served concurrently. Sentences served concurrently mean that they're all served at the same time. If you've got 1,000 sentences for 1 year, but they're served concurrently, that means you only do 1 year. Malcolm and Shorty got 10 years in prison. The girls got 1 to 5 years. They were sentenced in February 1946. Malcolm is 20 years old. He says, quote, "I wasn't quite 21 and I haven't even started shaving," end quote. He was sentenced to Charleston State Prison. About his time in jail, he says, quote, "Behind bars, a man never reforms. He will never forget. He never will completely get over the memory of the bars," end quote. Talks about being a fish, which is a new inmate, and it's an old prison that was built in 1805. The toilet was a covered pail. He says, quote, "He couldn't stand having to smell a row of defecation," end quote. His first letter in jail came from a religious brother in Detroit. I believe this is Reginald. His sister Ella was the first one to visit him. In jail, he found out how to get a small high from drinking nutmeg mixed with water, and he's eventually able to buy weed from the guards. In total, Malcolm served almost 7 years in prison. Malcolm says that he was disorderly in prison. He would throw things, curse out the guards, and refuse to answer. He said that he liked to be in solitary. He would curse the Bible and God. The people in prison came to call Malcolm Satan for his, quote, anti-religious attitude, and that's where the title of the chapter comes from. His first positive inmate that he met was someone named Bimby, and Malcolm met Bimby in 1947. He would be almost late 21, early 22 years old. Bimby was known for good conversation, and Malcolm says that, quote, "Even the guards would walk close to hear Bimby when he was speaking," end quote. Malcolm regarded Bimby as, quote, "the library's best customer," end quote. The reason why Malcolm was fascinated with Bimby, he says, quote, "What fascinated me most with him what fascinated me with him most of all was that he was the first man I had ever seen command total respect with his words," end quote. Bimby changed Malcolm's belief regarding atheism. Bimby recommended Malcolm take classes and go to the library. Malcolm remembers that he dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and that was at Mason Junior High. His sister Hilda recommended that Malcolm study English and penmanship to learn how to write better. He starts to order books from the library. A year later, Malcolm started writing better and began studying Latin to understand word derivations. He was trying to understand the origins of words and where they came from. Malcolm was in jail when Jackie Robinson went to the Brooklyn Dodgers. This is April 1947. He's still 21 years old. He says he became the biggest Jackie Robinson fan. In 1948, Malcolm was transferred to Concord Prison. His brother Filbert writes and tells him that he found, quote, "the natural religion for the black man," end quote. Reginald tells him to, quote, "Don't eat pork, don't smoke cigarettes, I'll show you how to get out of prison," end quote. Malcolm thought it was some kind of trick, but all he heard was get out of prison. So he was willing to do whatever that took. He stopped smoking cigarettes and eating pork immediately. He says that he believed, quote, if you take one step towards Allah, Allah will take 2 steps towards you," end quote. All of his brothers and sisters were converting to Islam except for Ella. Since Reginald had the closest relationship with Malcolm, the family felt that Reginald would be the best to convince Malcolm to practice Islam. His older sister Ella helped Malcolm to get transferred to a better prison. He was transferred to Norfolk. The prison was in Norfolk, Massachusetts, And this is in 1948. Malcolm's late 22, early 23 years old. He felt that the new prison was, quote, comparatively heaven, end quote. Regarding the prison at Norfolk, Malcolm says, quote, Norfolk prison colony represented the most enlightened form of prison that I had ever heard of, end quote. At this prison, they would have visits from teachers that were from Harvard and Boston University. He says the prison had a good library that specialized in history and religion. He says, quote, I read aimlessly until I learned to read selectively with a purpose, end quote. Reginald visits Malcolm again and tells him to, quote, God is man and there are 360 degrees of knowledge, end quote. He tells him that God came to America and made himself known to Elijah Muhammad. He says, quote, the devil's time is up, and he also tells him that's end quote, and he also tells him that the devil is a man, the white man. Malcolm recollects his memory on the white people that he knew in his past. He thinks about how the state separated his family, how they put his mother in a mental institution, the Swirlins, his teacher, Mr. Ostrowski, and he agreed that the whites that he had known in his life were devils. Reginald visits him again and talks about how the white man has, quote, brainwashed the black man, end quote. Reginald believes that, quote, the white man's world was on its way down, on its way out, end quote. He says, quote, you have been cut off by the devil, white man, from all true knowledge of your own kind, end quote. Malcolm began to receive 2 letters a day from his brothers and sisters in Detroit. They were now followers of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, a black man who was the messenger of Allah. Elijah Muhammad was born in Georgia and moved to Detroit, where he met Wallace D. Fard, quote-unquote, God in person. Malcolm's brothers and sisters wanted Malcolm to be a follower of Elijah Muhammad, and they taught him that Islam is the submission and atonement of one toward Allah. He was taught that the original man was black on the continent of Africa, building empires while whites were still in caves. Kidnapping Africans was human history's greatest crime. Africans had been cut off from their past. He says, quote, the slave master forced his family name upon this rape mixed race, which the slave master began to call the Negro, end quote. Blacks had been taught that Africans were heathens, and we would swing from trees like monkeys. Malcolm believed the slave master injected his Christian religion and concept of the blue-eyed God on slaves. And blacks were taught that to be black was a curse. He says that he couldn't go back to his former life, and he says that this revelation was like when Paul was on his way, when Paul in the Bible was on his way to Damascus, and he saw Jesus, and that changed his path. He correlates those 2 incidents. He says the truth can only be learned by a sinner who admits his guilt. He says, quote, the one who Jesus couldn't help were the Pharisees. They didn't feel they needed any help, end quote. Reginald goes back to Detroit, and Malcolm was only drinking water and barely eating. His sister Hilda came to visit him and told him to write to Elijah Muhammad. She told Malcolm about the origins of man, the original man, and Yaqub's creation of the white man. She says that Yaqub had a large head, and he was exiled with 60,000 others to the island of Patmos. There he created the white race. He talks about 2 germs, 2 germs in the black man, a black and a brown, and the recessive genes, and how he progressively made people lighter until he was able to create the white race. After 600 years of being in isolation, the white race came back and caused the blacks to fight each other within 6 months. The white devil was then chained and sent to Europe. He says after 2,000 years in caves, Moses from the Bible leads them to civilization. He says that this race would be allowed to rule for 6,000 years. And Malcolm says that, quote, it was written that some of the original people should be brought as slaves to North America to learn, to better understand at first hand the white devil's true nature in modern times, end quote. Malcolm was taught by Elijah Muhammad that the mightiest God was Master W.D. Fard, who was a half-black, half-white man. Elijah Muhammad met Master W.D. Fard in 1931 and got the message to save Negroes in America. His sister Hilda left after telling Malcolm about the Yaqub story. Malcolm says that tales like Yaqub infuriated Muslims in the East, but Malcolm says it was their fault. He says that their silence on Islam left a vacuum for, quote, any religious faker, end quote, to mislead our people. And that is the end of chapter 10. Make sure you share this video if you like what you heard. Let me know if there's anything you disagree with, and visit malcolmxfoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation. Other than that, I will see y'all in chapter 11. Thank you.